I wonder if you've ever had that thing where either yourself or a friend or a relative, they get a new car, maybe not a brand new car, but a new car to them. And it might be a kind of a type or brand of car that you've never really noticed before, but they've bought it and you've had a little look at it. And then as you're going around your travels, all you can see are these cars. And it's bizarre because you've never noticed them before. It feels like it was the first time you've ever really encountered this kind of car before, and now they're everywhere. Well, it's a really common thing to happen, and it happens in lots of different ways, with lots of different examples. Somebody might mention a band and say, have you heard of this band? And you'd be like, no, I've not heard of them at all. And they might play you a song of theirs. You're like, oh yeah, they're all right, yeah. But you've never heard of them before. And then in the next week, you find about 4 or 5 different references, like in a magazine, or you hear somebody else talking about them. And you're like, that's funny, because someone was only mentioning those the other day, and it was the first time, and now it seems like everybody's talking about them. Well, it's a common thing for most of us, I'd say, and we can all think of some example, if we put our minds to it, whereby we encounter something seemingly for the first time, and then once it's in our awareness, that seems to be all we see. And part of the reason for this is because our brains are quite remarkable instruments, because when you think what the brain has to put up with in any given moment, the amount of information that is just pouring into the brain, and yet it has to stay efficient. So amongst all the noise and the sounds and the textures and the touch and the feelings and the sights, all this information constantly pouring in, the brain has to make a decision about what's important and what's not important. So a lot of what the brain is doing is filtering out the noise of life. So it just gets you to the significant stuff. And so what happens when you might buy a car that seems an unusual brand, and then that's all you see? It's because your brain has switched that from an insignificant to a significant compartment. So it now starts to notice these things. It's like you've almost kind of retrained your brain in that moment as what are the things that are worth you noticing. It's a part of the brain which is called the reticular activation system. And it's that thing which kind of puts things on your radar, really, that weren't on your radar before. And so even though you're not conscious of it, you're specifically looking out for them should they appear. And so there's lots of different ways that our brain will work in that fashion. And there's a way we can really use that to our advantage. Because one of the ways that the brain is kind of hardwired evolutionarily is that it's kind of got a negative bias, the old brain, because it really wants you to remember things that might be dangerous to you. So if you were, hundreds of thousands of years ago and you were out there by a bush and a saber-toothed tiger should appear, then your brain really wants you to remember that situation so that you can protect yourself from it in future. And so consequently, we've evolved to have this kind of negative bias in the brain. It's just part of us, I guess. So what we can actually do then is we can actually change that wiring consciously. So if we use that part of our brain that is able to identify this new car that we hadn't noticed before, we can use that part of the brain to bring some good stuff consciously into our life, get the good stuff on the radar. And there's a really easy way of doing this. And it's why gratitude is such every study says that gratitude exercises benefit us. And this is why, really, because it gets us to notice the good stuff going on in life. So here's an idea for you. If you want to switch your radar on for good stuff, make it a practice of yours to actually recognize the good stuff. Maybe it's even a particular time of day. Maybe it's just, maybe just before you go to bed even, you'll just lie there and you'll have a little think and you'll come up with 3, 4, 5 things maybe that went well about today, that you're pleased with yourself maybe about today. And just in the way that getting this new car that you'd never noticed before switches on your radar for that car, you will then be switching on your radar for the good stuff that you might have otherwise missed. The compliment from a friend, for instance, or the piece of work that you did, but you haven't really let it land with yourself. These things start coming more into awareness because our brain will start to learn that at the end of each day, we need to find 3, 4, or 5 of these things before we go to sleep. And so we start noticing them more. And the other nice thing is that we actually go to sleep in a better state because we're going to sleep in a positive state. Now, when you go to sleep, you're going to spend 8 hours, aren't you? Basically with the hangover of the moments before you went to sleep. So why not make them good ones? Why not look out for the times where you're pleased with yourself that day, that something went well for you? Because as well as having 8 hours of sleep that are predicated on these good feelings, throughout the waking time, your radar system, that thing which spots the car that you'd never seen before, and suddenly they're everywhere, will start looking out for the good stuff in you. And so just help correct that evolutionary hardwiring that makes us more negatively biased and brings us more into a positive balance. So if you like the ideas in this podcast, then feel free to review us on Apple Podcast or share it with your friends. And you might even want to work with me. I'm at liverpoolpsychotherapy.co.uk. You can work with me online, or you can work with me in person. I've got an office in Rodney Street. And thanks for listening, and I'll see you on the next one.